Hello and welcome to the JSA Studio. I'm your host, as always, Nathan, and today we're going to be looking at the top 10 players for each offensive position in this upcoming draft class. But before we get into that, I would like to preface this video by asking you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment down below, all that YouTube stuff. And now, getting into the actual content of this video, before we get into the rankings, I feel it important to talk about the objective fact of reality that I've had many bad takes. And it's not just that I may be wrong with some of the things that I'm going to say in this video, it's that I am wrong about some of the things I'm going to say in this video. And I know that. So whether I'm talking about Rome Odunze or Blake Corum or Jordan Morgan or whoever, take this for what it is, my opinion. And my opinion is probably wrong. But here's a dirty little secret that not many people other than me are going to tell you. Everyone's wrong, including professional scouts when they say things. Otherwise, why would we ever have a bust, ever, or a guy who did not meet expectations? Everyone is wrong all the time. And speaking of things that I'm probably wrong on, let's go ahead and dip into the quarterback rankings. Now, I've already made a video on the top 10 quarterback rankings, so I'm not going to rehash that here, but I am going to use this time to talk about Spencer Rattler because I didn't in that top 10 quarterback rankings video because I was planning on making his own individual dedicated film breakdown video, and I don't have time for that. So I'm just going to do like a little 5 to 10 minute segment on Spencer Rattler here, like I should have just done in the top 10 quarterback ranking video. Spencer Rattler, to me, is unequivocally a boomer bust prospect, and he is someone who has the tools and enough good throws on tape and good plays on tape and shows enough in terms of progressing through routes and stuff like that that makes me feel confident in taking a risk on him. And because of that, I end up with a top 40 grade on him, which is back end of the first round or very early second round. Is he going to go that high? No, he's not. Straight up, I know that, but I'm higher on him than pretty much everybody else. The reason that I'm high on Spencer Rattler is twofold. Number one, he does have good, admittedly not great though, tools. His arm, I would quantify it as good. Like, definitely it's not great or elite by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's good. It's sort of in that like Derek Carr sort of tier in terms of arm talent. And even though he ran a 4.9, like 240 or whatever he ran at the combine, on film he shows a lot of elusiveness and the ability to outrun defensive players. So it's not going to be as dramatic as like a Patrick Mahomes, like what I'm going to say. But I do think that 40 time is maybe a little bit Patrick Mahomes-like, because I think Mahomes ran like 4.8 something, and he's obviously faster than that on film. And I think Spencer Rattler is faster than 4.9 on film as well. But getting into an actual breakdown of his game, it is really hard to evaluate Spencer Rattler. But not in the way that it's like hard to evaluate J.J. McCarthy or other quarterbacks where the scheme was very clearly limiting what they could do. It's because the scheme wasn't limiting what Spencer Rattler could do. It's a pretty typical, normal, like college sort of offense. The problem is his talent around him limited him. Bro had one receiver who I like a lot in Xavier Legette, but he's a day 2 pick. He had no offensive line. In fact, his offensive line was so horrible. It was unbelievably bad. Maybe the worst offensive line in the Power 5. Actually, I didn't even think maybe. It was the worst offensive line in the Power 5. And probably half of the group of 5 offensive lines were better than his offensive line at South Carolina. To illustrate how bad his offensive line was at South Carolina, I'm going to tell you 2 numbers, okay? And they're both statistics on pressure rate, or the percentage of times where any of the 5 offensive linemen give up a pressure on a play. Spencer Rattler's pressure rate was almost 40%. It was 39.2%, which is absurdly bad. And to put that number in context, I'm going to tell you the second number that I was talking about. In the NFL last year, the Tennessee Titans had the worst offensive line in the NFL in terms of pressure rate. By the way, that's per ProFootballReference.com. At 27.5%. So Spencer Rattler's offensive line was 12 percentage points worse than the worst offensive line in the NFL. He was pressured more than any other quarterback that I can remember watching film on, like ever, since I've been doing this. And because of that absurd amount of pressure, his game really, really suffered. And it became more and more prevalent as the season went on. But he also didn't particularly handle the pressure all that well. Early on in the season, he did. But he just got beat up so much and so consistently in every game that I really think, for lack of a better word, he would even enter games without having played a snap rattled. And I don't think he's ever going to have to face that kind of just horrible offensive line play ever again in the NFL, because, as I said, the worst offensive line in the NFL was still significantly better than his offensive line, relatively speaking. So I think a lot of that good film that you see early on of him standing in the pocket and taking hits and delivering catchable balls into tight windows, I think that becomes more prevalent with a better offensive line and honestly some better weapons, because his receivers did drop quite a few passes. He also didn't have any real semblance of a running game either. And because of all these factors all adding up, Spencer Rattler was basically in Caleb Williams' hero mode from the beginning of the game to the end of the game. And even Caleb Williams, or Drake May, who also gets a lot of flack for going hero mode, did not nearly have to go into hero mode in order to win games as often as Spencer Rattler did. Last thing with Spencer Rattler that I want to talk about is that there is some quote-unquote off-the-field stuff with him, and I don't really think that's all that big of a deal. I think he was very clearly immature and not ready to be a college athlete with the spotlight on him when he first arrived at Oklahoma, and very much so got humbled during his time there, and then transferred to South Carolina, and basically is now a completely different person. Like, if you listen to him doing interviews now, he very openly talks about how he was a different person at Oklahoma than he was at South Carolina. And you ask his teammates about him at South Carolina, and they don't really have anything bad to say. So I don't really think the quote-unquote off-the-field stuff is really all that much of a concern for me. Now, it would be better if I could do like a top 30 interview with him, but I don't have the ability to do that. So I could certainly be wrong, but I don't really see that as a problem for him long term. He really kind of seems like a guy that's moved on from that sort of arrogant frat boy sort of persona that he had early on in his college career. And it's because of the contextual stuff with his film and the fact that he kind of had like a little character arc going on throughout his college football career. This just seems like a guy who's very professional now and would be willing to put in the work, and he has the tools. And if you're willing to put in the work and you have the tools, you've got a pretty good chance of being successful. So I would be willing to take him in the back end of the first round, provided I am the type of situation where I can sit him for a year or maybe 2 years or maybe even 3 years like Jordan Love. So moving on to the running backs now. The grading system that I use is a little bit weird, to say the least. Basically, it's on a scale of 100 to 0, and it's basically like a percentile sort of situation where the closer you are to 100, the better you are. I will also say this, a score of 100, which we're not going to have in this video, but a score of 100 does not mean you are a perfect prospect. It means you are the best prospect that I have seen at that position. Each grade in terms of the positions, in terms of the actual numbers for those positions, is only relative to that position. So a running back graded as a 99.54 is not graded as highly, quote unquote, as a quarterback with a grade of 99.54. Okay? The objective sort of where I would draft them is the other grade, which is top 40, top 50, top 75, top 100, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and then PDUFA, which is priority undrafted free agent or undrafted free agent after that. I am very harsh on running backs, okay? The perfect running back prospect, or at least the best running back prospect that I've ever seen, which right now is Saquon Barkley, still would only earn a top 40 grade. Because there is nothing in the modern NFL that a running back can do that will be equivalent in terms of value added to a top 20 pick. Because the sad fact of reality is running backs are easily replaceable, and they break down after they reach the 1,500 touches mark in the NFL. And that just means that their value as a position is not as great as other positions that have more longevity. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the actual prospects. My number one running back is Trey Benson out of Florida State, because one of the traits that I value the most in terms of running backs is the ability to house a ball from anywhere on the field. If you aren't a big play threat as a running back, I don't particularly want you on my team. And even though there are other roles that a running back can do, yes, I'm going to value the players that have the ability to break off a big run consistently and then outrun everybody more than I am going to value sort of a power guy who's going to consistently get you 3 to 5 yards every play. Because the guys that can score from anywhere are inherently more valuable, because if you don't have a great or elite offensive line, then the guys that are going to get you 3 to 5 yards per carry aren't actually going to get you 3 to 5 yards per carry. They're going to get you like 2 or 3 at most. But the guy that can house the ball, if you give him one lane, then he can get a big gain out of that. So those types of players are more valuable to me. And Trey Benson, I think, is the perfect mixture of both of those things. Trey Benson ran 4.3 at the combine, very, very fast. He can house the ball from anywhere. However, he's also big enough and has good enough feet, in my opinion, to sort of be that guy who can also get you consistently 3 to 5 yards on every play. So I think he's kind of the full package. He can catch the ball a little bit, but I don't necessarily see that being an actual strength of his at the next level. He could get better. It's very possible. But right now, I would kind of consider him maybe in that 2 down sort of mold. And then you kind of bring in like a dedicated pass catcher sort of guy, or a complementary back, change of pace back, so to speak, in a more obvious sort of passing situation, like on a 3rd and 7+ or something like that. I think that would be a very good role for him. I do think he has Pro Bowl upside as well. Jordan Brooks is the same sort of story, and he's my number 2 back. The reason that he's number 2 and Trey Benson is number 1 is because, unfortunately, Jordan Brooks tore his ACL most of the way through this past season. I don't know if he's going to be ready at the beginning of the year. I think there's a possibility that he will be, but I think there's also a possibility that you're going to have to hold him out for a little bit. Because of that, that does push him down slightly, but it's more so we didn't get the athletic testing, but he's also a guy that measured at 6 foot 215, similar hand size, similar arm length as Trey Benson. If he had ran in the mid 4.4s, which is where I think he likely would have ran, he probably would have been my number 1 back, because I do think that he's just slightly better than Trey Benson. He doesn't have the big play threat ability that Trey Benson has, because for whatever reason he just broke a lot of big plays in his career at Florida State. But Brooks strikes me as a safer, quote unquote, prospect that I still think offers that sort of Pro Bowl running back upside as well. And number 3 is another guy built in a very similar mold to those first two in Braylon Allen out of Wisconsin. This is a guy who's 6'1", 235 pounds, plays surprisingly light on his feet, does have a little bit of elusiveness to him, so he's not like completely doesn't know what to do when he gets into the open field and there's only one guy between him and the end zone. However, generally speaking, he is a straight line sort of guy. I do really, really like him as sort of a, not a Derrick Henry, because I don't think he's going to be Derrick Henry, but a player in that mold or style, so to speak, where he's someone that you got to give him 20 carries and then he's going to start ripping off 6-7 yards and maybe a big play here or there. That's the sort of role that I see him evolving into, and I do genuinely think that he's going to be a productive NFL player for a relatively long time for the position, because he is kind of built to take the hits, so to speak. And those are my top 3 guys. I really like those guys. They check just about every box. Allen did not run the 40 at either his pro day or the combine, which is interesting to say the least. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. It could just be that he didn't want to do it and he doesn't like running it. He's afraid he might tweak his hamstring or something. I don't know. Or it could be that he's running like high 4.5s or low 4.6s and he knows that it's going to tank his draft stock. So I don't know, but I definitely would have liked to have seen him run the 40-yard dash. Someone who dramatically shot up my board after the combine with their 40-yard dash was Jalen Wright, who I did not expect him to weigh and be as big as he was, and also as fast as he was. Now, I don't know if Jalen Wright actually played at 210, but he didn't look 210 on film, and maybe that's just me not realizing what 210 looks like. I don't think that's the case, but I guess that's a possibility. But he didn't look that big on film, and the fact that he weighed in on that and still ran 4.38 is really, really good, because he's got the size and the weight now to be an every down back while also being someone who has a lot of experience running routes and catching the football and has the big play threat ability. The only real thing separating Jalen Wright from those top 3 guys is that those top 3 guys, with the exception of Jordan Brooks, but his 1 year on film was spectacular, have multiple years of production, and also they are a little bit bigger than him. I do think it's close. Jalen Wright is on the cusp of being a top 50 pick for me, but I just am held back slightly by it. And same sort of thing with Marshawn Lloyd out of USC. I really, really liked his film. He was really, really good. Catching the football, running. Also, he came in at 220 at the scouting combine and still ran 4.46, which is a very good time for that weight. He is someone who I think could legitimately be an every down back. However, even if he isn't an every down back, I do see him as someone who could just be a change of pace back, so to speak, like a Devin Singletary sort of role. Now, obviously, he's bigger than Devin Singletary, but that sort of role and position where he's a change of pace back and he's really just there to catch passes out of the backfield. I could see him falling back on that if the every down running back sort of thing doesn't work out. However, for the most part, those top 5 guys are the guys that I do think have that sort of every down potential. And pretty much from here on out, I think we're talking more about role players, with one exception, than more so like all around every down sort of backs. And number 6 is Will Shipley. Will Shipley, to me, is someone who is scheme specific. He needs to be in a zone blocking scheme, because he's not a one-cut kind of back, get up north and south. He needs to be able to read and then find the hole where he can explode through it and get 4 or 5 yards, because he's not breaking a whole lot of tackles. His game is more about elusiveness. He's also a excellent receiver out of the backfield, and that's where his role is going to be at the next level. And I do like him. I do have a top 100 grade on him, which is sort of third round sort of territory. Basically, it's just a third round sort of grade. Now, Will Shipley did not elect to compete at the combine. However, he did go pretty much everything you would want to see out of the combine at the pro day. He did run 4.39, which is a good time for him. I was thinking he was low 4.4s, sort of mid 4.4s, like in that 4.42, 4.43 sort of range. So he outperformed expectations there. However, people always perform better at their pro days than they do at the combine. So generally speaking, I lean more towards combine numbers. Now, he didn't compete, so I got to do what I got to do with this. But 4.39 is a good time for him, and it does show the upside to potentially be a big play threat there. Moving on to number 7, who I have as Blake Corum out of Michigan. I have a 4th round grade on him. Now, remember a couple of minutes ago where I said the top 5 guys are really the only guys that I see with the potential to be an every down sort of back? Blake Corum was the one that I said with an exception, because Blake Corum didn't catch passes out of the backfield at Michigan, but I do think that's something that he'll be able to do at the next level, and I think he'll actually honestly be pretty good at it. My main problem with Blake Corum is that at 5'8" and 204 pounds, he ran 4.53. If you're that small, you need to be running low 4.4s for me. And the long speed was a problem for Blake Corum heading into this process, and he kind of just hit for par there. Like low 4.5s, it is what it is, but it does limit his role in my mind. I think he's probably going to be best utilized as a change of pace back for a team that wants to have a sort of shiftier big play threat as their number 1 running back. So he's the guy that they bring in short yardage situations or potentially the goal line. And also he is someone who could potentially catch the ball out of the backfield. I don't think David Montgomery, now David Montgomery is just bigger than him in general, but I don't think David Montgomery is a bad comp for him, specifically in the way Chicago used him. And yes, he did go to the Lions and have a very, very good year, but in my opinion, that had more to do with the fact that the Lions' offensive line is very good. But if Blake Corum went to the right situation, then I could legitimately see him being an every down running back, catches the ball out of the backfield and can get 25 touches a game and get you like 120 yards and a touchdown. He could absolutely be like that. But what ultimately holds him back is the traits. And traits, to me, matter the most out of any offensive position for the running backs. And the long speed is the most important trait, in my opinion, at least for what I'm looking for in running backs. So even though there is upside, I'm still probably pushing him down the board farther than most people. Really quickly, his last 3 guys, these are role players. Bucky Irving, to me, is a scat back. He's someone who, even though I really like his film, and he does run hard and break a lot of tackles, I don't think he's going to be able to do that at the next level, and he's going to have to lean into his shiftiness and his explosiveness as a pass catcher out of the backfield. Ray Davis is a 1 to 2 down back who, in passing situations, unless he's blocking, you don't particularly want on the field. Dylan Johnson, the same sort of situation with him. I just like Ray Davis a little bit more because he does have more of that long speed than Dylan Johnson. So those are my top 10 running backs. Next up is tight ends. Now, my tight end grades are kind of similar to the running backs, but I do have a top 10 grade for tight ends. And that's because I think tight end is a more valuable position than running backs, because having an elite caliber tight end is far more impactful than having an elite caliber running back. Now, my number 1 tight end, as everybody else's is Brock Bowers. I will also say this: Brock Bowers is my number 2 tight end all time. I still have Kyle Pitts graded higher than him. Basically, there's nothing that I can tell you about Brock Bowers that you haven't already heard. He's very fast. He's very elusive. He can take any ball that he touches to the house. He's a matchup nightmare, and he's a pretty good blocker as well. My number 2 tight end, also pretty much what everybody else's number 2 tight end is Jatavion Sanders out of Texas. And I like Sanders a lot. I'm higher on him than I think most people because I do think he has a chance to sneak in the back end of the first round, specifically to the team picking 32nd overall, assuming another Texas player isn't there for that team to take at 32. Anyway, Sanders is a smooth operator. He catches the ball easily. He's got some upside as an athlete, and I think he's just got multi-year, like decade-long starter in the NFL written all over him. Theo Johnson is the I'm a great athlete, even though the film isn't really all that good, but also the film isn't good, maybe because the scheme and my quarterback wasn't very good player in this tight end group. So there's a little bit of nuance with Theo Johnson. He's a very good tight end. Penn State's put some tight ends into the NFL very recently that have been pretty solid, and a big time athlete. But the film isn't great. Now you dig into it a lot and you see a lot more of the positives, and you do see those athletic traits shine. But Penn State's offense was just extraordinarily bad and broken last year, so he didn't really have the opportunity to show off what he could do potentially. But I do have a top 50 grade on him. I'm pretty high on him specifically because of the traits and the athletic upside. Another guy that I am higher on than most people is Jaheim Bell out of Florida State. I really like this kid. Listen, he's not going to be a Y tight end at the next level. He's not. In fact, in all reality, he's probably a slot receiver. In all honesty, he's probably a big slot. But I think he's going to excel in that role. I think he's a very good athlete, and I think he's someone who, given the opportunity to produce, could consistently produce as like a third option in an offense, like 800 yards, 6 or 7 touchdowns a year on like 60, 65 catches. That is where I see Jaheim Bell sort of flourishing as like an H tight end. My number 5 tight end is A.J. Barner, who is the exact opposite of Jaheim Bell. He's a Y tight end. He is a hand in the dirt, end of the line tight end who has some pretty good athletic upside, and I just think he's all around a very, very safe prospect in a weaker tight end class. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if he went day 2 to a team that wants that sort of traditional Y tight end sort of deal going on. Ben Sinnott is another guy kind of like A.J. Barner. Pretty good athlete for the position. He's sort of a Y tight end. But the question with him is, can he block? Like, I think there's upside there as a pass catcher, as sort of like maybe a tight end 2 or a rotational tight end as well. But the question with him is really, can he block? And if he can get more physical and utilize his leverage a little bit better, I think he's someone who could potentially develop into a starting tight end. But I don't know about that. I think he's probably more of a tight end 2 kind of guy. And if he can't really develop as a blocker, which I do think he has the size and ability to develop as a blocker, then he's probably going to be regulated to like tight end 2 or big slot duties as like a rotational player. And that doesn't spell well for his ability to stay in the NFL. So Jared Wiley and Dallin Holker are both guys that are kind of the same but opposite, so to speak. Jared Wiley, really good straight line speed. Dallin Holker, really good agility. Neither one of them are going to be guys that you're going to put on the line as a Y tight end, in my opinion. They could probably handle blocking duties in space if they're on like a smaller sort of linebacker, so to speak. But he's probably going to have to make his money as a situational tight end 2 or 3. Both of them, Jared Wiley and Dallin Holker. I don't see a whole lot of upside with them in terms of being like an actual consistent contributor to an offense. At number 9, I have Cade Stover out of Ohio State. And he is someone who I think blocks pretty okay. But his sort of bread and butter would have to be as a pass-catching tight end in the NFL, because he just lacks the functional strength to be a consistent blocking tight end. And I don't like him as a pass catcher all that much. Now, he was pretty much the only receiver that Kyle McCord would look at who wasn't named Marvin Harrison. But a lot of those targets, I think, were forced. I think if Ohio State ran an actual offense this past season, he probably would not have gotten nearly as much production as he would have. I do think he's someone who struggles to move once he has the ball. He does move in and out of breaks pretty well, but he's not someone that I'm very confident in going to be able to produce at the next level, because I don't think he's physical enough to run routes against a bigger safety, and I don't think he's athletic enough to run routes against a quicker linebacker. So I really just kind of struggled to see what his role would be at the next level. And because of that, I got the 6th-round grade on him. Trey Knox out of South Carolina, he's someone who's a good athlete. I had to pick a 10th guy. I do have a draftable grade on him, but it's like on the cusp of becoming a priority undrafted free agent. I think his roles as a big slot, and I think he could potentially be productive in that role. But it's a 7th-round pick. You're really taking him for his potential special teams value, which I do think he would add some value as a special teamer. Now we're getting into the fun part of this video, the wide receiver grades. First thing I need to say is that wide receiver isn't a position. There are 3 positions for wide receivers: X, the slot, and the Z. And they're all looking for slightly different things at those positions. So these wide receiver grades are going to be broken down into 3 different categories. Like I already said, X, slot, and Z receivers. We'll get into a little bit of the specifics for what those receivers are when we talk about each of those positions in the individual segments. So we're going to go ahead and transition here to the X receiver. So what are you looking for with an X receiver? Generally speaking, X receivers win on the outside, where they play almost exclusively through physicality and leverage. They're not necessarily great athletes, although straight line speed is something that you do look for with these players. A stereotypical X receiver in terms of their role, the routes they run, and how they play is DK Metcalf. Now, DK Metcalf is also absurdly straight line fast. However, he's not very quick, and he does kind of struggle to run routes that involve a lot of agility, so to speak, which is why he doesn't typically run them very often. And he pretty much just stays on the outside and runs slants, goes, curls, or digs, and that's about it. And that's not a knock on DK Metcalf. That's just what the X receiver role is. So who are my top 10 X receivers in this class? Well, no surprise to anybody, I got Marvin Harrison Jr. number 1. Now, Marvin Harrison is not my highest graded wide receiver of all time. That remains, and likely will remain for forever, Justin Jefferson. However, he is one of the safest prospects at the wide receiver position that I've ever scouted. This is a guy who can play the X, he can play the Z, you could stick him in the slot if you want to. This is someone who we know for a fact is going to be productive and probably make 4 or 5 Pro Bowls minimum at the next level. This is a guy who will likely be a top 20 receiver in the NFL year 1, and by year 2 be pushing into the top 10. And maybe potentially by year 3, we're talking about first team All-Pro sort of situation with him. His body control is his best attribute. He works the sidelines very well. Didn't have great quarterback play this past year, but he was still very productive. And natural hands. Doesn't really do a whole lot after the catch, but he doesn't particularly need to. It's just a very, 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 very clean prospect all around. My number 2 X receiver is Rome Odunze out of Washington, who I have a top 10 grade on. And he was almost my number 3 wide receiver as an X, with Brian Thomas, who I have at number 3. And I'm going to talk about the both of them. I really like Brian Thomas. I have Brian Thomas as a top 10 grade. Maybe not a top 10 player. I haven't completed scouting, so I don't know what my big board is yet. But right now, he's a top 10 player in the class, regardless of position for me. I love Brian Thomas. I love everything that he does. I think he can play all three positions. And Romo Dunze, I do think is pretty much just an X, though. However, Romo Dunze is better as an X receiver than Brian Thomas is as an X receiver. And I do think, for the most part, Brian Thomas's role at the next level will be as an X receiver. Romo Dunze is extraordinarily good in contested catch situation. Brian Thomas, I think, is also good, but Romo Dunze is borderline elite in those scenarios, and Brian Thomas is just good. Romo Dunze doesn't have the speed or agility that Brian Thomas does. However, he's plenty good enough in both of those categories. I also think Romo Dunze is a little bit more refined as a route runner. I think he utilizes leverage a lot better and his body to block out receivers a lot better. And all around, I do think he's just kind of slightly better. Although I will say this, I do think Brian Thomas's ceiling is higher than Romo Dunze's. Adani or A.D. Mitchell out of Texas is my number 4 X receiver. And this is a guy that entering the process, I was not very high on. I had a top, I think, 75 grade on him. And then I actually dug into the film and the scouting combine, and I got it. It clicked for me very suddenly. And I was like, oh, this is a really good route runner who's also very, very good in contested catch situations and an elite caliber athlete. Oh, yeah, this is a top 20 pick. Now, he might not go in the top 20 because this wide receiver class is loaded, but this is a top 20 pick. I got Keon Coleman at 5. He's faster than 4.6 on film, but that did, I think, knock him down a little bit for me at the combine when he ran 4.6. Now, also, we talked about the gauntlet drill. They were talking about that because of Pukanuka. He was the fastest through the gauntlet drill. He ran like 18 miles an hour through the gauntlet drill, which is impressive to say the least. He might have the best hands of any receiver in this class, and that's a statement because there are a lot of receivers that make a lot of really good catches in this class. Keon Coleman, I think his numbers in contested catch situations are a little bit misleading because a lot of his contested catch situations were not very well thrown contested catch situations, whereas someone like Romo Dunze or Brian Thomas were put into better positions to make contested catches, so to speak. Keon Coleman is also a extraordinarily underrated player with the ball in his hands. He makes people miss. He can take it to the house. He's faster than 4.6 on film. Like, this is a very, very good wide receiver who, coming into this year, I was very high on. I was thinking that he was maybe going to be pushing into the top 10 if he could have a productive season. Now, Florida State didn't really throw the ball like I wanted them to throw the ball, but they had Trey Benson, so they didn't really need to. Needless to say, my number 6 X receiver is another Florida State product, Johnny Wilson. And I battled back and forth between leaving Johnny Wilson here or moving into the tight end group, because that's kind of the smoke on him, is especially in this weak tight end class, he might move to the tight end position because he's 6'6" and like a half, I think is what he measured at the compounds. And he still ran really well. Like, I think he definitely has a lot of upside as a big slot or a tight end receiver. But as an X receiver, I think he's kind of just okay. And because of that, I actually think he has way more upside as a tight end and a guy that could potentially work as a red zone threat than he does have as an actual X receiver. At number 7, I have Brendan Rice, Jerry Rice's son, out of USC. I think he's underrated. I think he's a very good blocker. I think he's someone who could be a third or fourth option in a scheme and just be like solid. Like, you can throw him the football and he's going to catch it, and he might do something with it after the catch. He might not. But he plays with great physicality. He's pretty good in contested catch situations, and he's a better than advertised route runner. Number 8 might shock some people. Cornelius Johnson out of Michigan. I think this is somebody who's going to play in the NFL for a very long time as a third or fourth receiver who can kind of really play all three positions. But really his value is going to be as a core special teamer. This is a guy who's going to be on all 4 special teams. He's going to be on kickoff, kick return, punt, and punt return, and he's going to be good in that role because he is someone who plays with tremendous physicality. He's a better route runner than people give him credit for, And he's a significantly better athlete than I thought he was as well. And unfortunately, I think Michigan's scheme kind of limited his ability to show how good he was. Now, I don't think he would trade it because he's got a national championship ring. But I think if he went to a different situation, I think he would be more talked about in this potentially even early day 3 sort of conversation. The last guy that I have here is Devon Vele out of Utah, and he's kind of the same thing as Cornelius Johnson, but I think he has less upside as a wide receiver. If you're going to draft him, it's really going to be because of the special teams value, although I do think he has upside as a receiver because he's listed at 6'4", and he actually plays pretty good on film. Last guy is Jalen Coker out of Holy Cross, who have a priority undrafted free agent grade on him. I think he does have upside as a wide receiver and a special teams player, so he is someone who I would maybe reach out to before a lot of other people after the draft. Moving on to the slot receiver position, I have Malik Neighbors as number 1. This isn't a surprise to anybody. I have a top 5 grade on him, and I love Malik Neighbors. I think he's someone who could also play Z. I don't think he has to be exclusively someone who plays in the slot. But for slot receivers, what I'm looking for is primarily agility. You need to be able to break in and out routes and control your body weight very well. And I am looking for more after the catch ability than I am with the X receiver. Like being able to make a guy miss or potentially work in the open field is a bonus for an X receiver, but it's a necessity for a slot receiver, in my opinion. And Malik Neighbors checks all those boxes. He's extraordinarily explosive. He's a tremendous route runner and very good with the ball in his hands. So I really, really like Malik Neighbors. And Malachi Corley is another guy that has sort of become the hidden gem that everybody talks about. Him being that sort of guy that nobody talks about, which means that everybody's talking about him. Out of Western Kentucky, I like him. I do. He's my number 2 slot receiver for a reason, but I also have a top 50 grade on him for a reason. I don't really see wide receiver 1 upside. I think in specific situations, he could be a very productive wide receiver 2. But he is someone who breaks tackles, makes people miss. He's very, very good with the ball in his hands. You can get him in screens, and he'll be able to make something out of nothing, potentially. Jalen McMillan out of Washington. I think this is someone who, if he had been healthy, probably would be talked about more as like a slot 2 and maybe a borderline first round kind of guy. Now, this wide receiver class is very, very good. So borderline first round guys are going to go at the end of the second round. But I really like Jalen McMillan. He's got good size. He's an excellent route runner, catches everything, works with the ball pretty okay. But he mainly wins just by being a better route runner than everybody else, and I do really like him. Number 4, I have Roman Wilson, who it appears I'm a little bit lower on. I think most people have him going in that middle to late second round, potentially early third round sort of position for him. I don't really see that. I wouldn't be mad. Like, it wouldn't piss me off if he went in that range, but I'm just a little bit lower on him. I'd feel more comfortable taking him in the third round because I do think he is someone who you're going to have to scheme for a little bit. And not from like a defense having to scheme for you, but on offense, you're going to have to scheme for him because I don't really think he's going to be able to survive against press coverage really at all. And Michigan did not ask him to do a whole lot. There was a lot of sending him in motion and just letting him be faster than most people to get open. But when he was running routes, he was very, very good. And he dominated the Senior Bowl. And because of that, he does have a significant amount of upside. But because of the size and the fact that he was not as fast as I thought he was, it did push him down the board a little bit for me. Ricky Pearsall out of Florida is up next. This is someone who I think could also be a Z. In fact, I almost just put him in the Z category. But I do think he will make his home predominantly in the slot at the next level. And he has excellent hands. He's a very good athlete, runs routes well, but he's really relying on his athleticism to run routes, which is good and bad if you're a good athlete, but at some point you're going to lose that athleticism. So like if he gets to 30, he's going to have gotten better at running routes, which I think he likely will get better at running routes by the time he gets to 30. But overall, I like him. I think he's going to be a very productive, potentially wide receiver 2 sort of player. Jacob Cowing out of Arizona is one of the biggest my guys in this class. I really like him. I think he's potential to be a deep threat receiver. I think he's a punt returner day one who's really, really good. But I really like the upside as a potential complementary piece to a receiving core. Now, Roman Wilson and him, I think, are similar players. They're similar speed, similar size. Roman Wilson is a much better route runner, which is why I have Cowing as a 4th round grade and Roman Wilson as a top 100 grade, borderlining on a top 75 grade. But I do like Cowing a lot. I think in a specific role, he could be a tremendously productive wide receiver 3. Same sort of situation with Anais Smith out of Texas A&M, who I also really like. I think he's someone who could potentially become a factor on special teams, but also I think he's someone who, as just sort of like a traditional slot receiver that's working over the middle and running a lot of outbreaking routes, could be very productive. Malik Washington, also the same sort of story. 6, 7, and 8 are all very, very, very close. So if you want to move those guys around, you want to put Malik Washington at 6, I'm not going to get angry with you because I like Malik Washington. I think Malik Washington is maybe the best athlete of those 3 guys. And I think he probably runs the best routes out of those 3 guys. And I also think that he's very good after the catch as well. I really just had to pick an order, but they're really the same player almost, all 3 of these guys, just different roles. And number 9, I have Taj Washington out of USC. I'm just concerned about the size with him, but he puts a lot on film that you really, really like. He's a very good route runner, and he's quick and fast, which is sort of rare. Anthony Gould at Oregon State is my 10th receiver. Straight line speed, special teams sort of guy for me. Moving on to Z receivers. So Z receivers have 2 roles primarily. The first of which is the outside receiver that plays either off the line or on the line. It doesn't particularly matter all that much, but doesn't necessarily win through physicality and leverage and being better at catching the football than the defensive back, but instead wins through route running, being quick and agile, and then making moves after the catch. Think Davante Adams as your prototypical Z wide receiver. He's not really in the slot, but he plays like a slot receiver on the outside. The second role is the deep threat receiver, often used to open up the middle of the field for the underneath routes or to genuinely just take a shot. A player very recently has sort of repopularized that specific mold for a wide receiver, and that's Tyreek Hill. Plays a lot in the slot too, but he also plays quite a bit as a Z receiver on the outside, where he can win with his quickness off the line and just by being faster than everybody else. And that dichotomy in roles is defined greatly by my number 1 and number 2 wide receivers in the Z position. Ladd McConkey is more in that Davante Adams sort of role. I'm not saying he's going to be Davante Adams. Davante Adams is arguably the best receiver in the NFL since Calvin Johnson, so I'm not necessarily sure Ladd McConkey has that kind of upside, but he fills that same sort of role where he's going to win on the outside with his quickness and route running, as opposed to Xavier Worthy, who's going to be used more in motion and as a deep threat and very often as a decoy. Xavier Worthy broke the combine record for fastest 40 time. He's very, very, very fast. He is decent with the ball in his hands. I don't particularly think he got to show that a whole lot at Texas because him and Quinn Ewers just flat out and straight up didn't have very much chemistry, really at all. Quinn Ewers was far more comfortable with A.D. Mitchell than he was with Xavier Worthy. And even though they worked fine together, Xavier Worthy did at times kind of feel like a third option for Texas. And I do think that has held him back in this draft process, so to speak. However, I still think there's a very definitive possibility he's the fourth receiver taken in this class behind the big three guys. I wouldn't take him as the fourth receiver in this class. I mean, he's my number 2 Z wide receiver, and I would take the other 3 over him and Brian Thomas and A.D. Mitchell and also maybe Keon Coleman and definitely Ladd McConkey because I have him ranked ahead of Xavier Worthy. So I don't know, but I think there's a very definitive possibility that someone in the 10 to 20 range is going to take Xavier Worthy simply because he's low 4.2 speed and could probably be an effective Z wide receiver day one, even if he never improves with route running or he isn't as good as I think he could be with the ball in his hands. My number 3 wide receiver for the Z position is Xavier Legette. He's also someone that I think could play the X. However, when you watch him on film, he doesn't really win with physicality. He wins on a lot of crossing routes and a lot of go routes. So basically routes that are pure speed. So he kind of plays like that Xavier Worthy, Tyreek Hill sort of Z wide receiver. However, I do think that he does have the physical ability to play like an X or to win in a more Z receiver sort of route running based way. Now, he isn't that level of route runner quite yet, but he could potentially become that. I think he's a good enough athlete to potentially develop into a very, very good route runner. My number 4 is Jalen Polk out of Washington. He is tremendously underrated, I think, in this class. He's borderline a top 50 guy for me, and I reserve the right to not only change his ranking, but anybody's ranking at any time that I see fit. So he might end up as a top 50 player for me in this upcoming draft class because I really like Jalen Polk. I think he's very, very good at all 3 positions. I think in a pinch, he could play the X and win with physicality and in a jump ball situation because he's very good in contested catch situations. I also think he can win with route running as a Z receiver, and I also think you could put him in the slot and he'd be tremendously productive there as well. Moving on to my number 5 and 6 Z wide receivers, I have Troy Franklin and Tez Walker, and I'm going to talk about both of them at the same time because they're the same player. They're the same build and the same player, except for Tez Walker is a little bit faster than Troy Franklin. And specifically with Troy Franklin, I really don't see wide receiver 1 upside with either of these 2 players. I think they are complementary deep threat pieces who, if utilized creatively, could be higher end wide receiver 2s at the next level. But the fact that they're so skinny and neither one of them really has a whole lot of consistently winning against physical corners on their tape. Now, they were not put in that position very often, neither one of them. But that is a massive question mark for them, is can they win when corners are physical with them, or are they exclusively going to have to be off the line of scrimmage and to win with quickness and stuff like that, which they could still very easily do in that scenario. But I'm just not, generally speaking, a fan of that receiver build, that sort of 6'1", 6'2" wide receiver that's skinny as hell and not as fast as you think he is. I'm just not a big fan of that receiver. Pretty much the only one that I've ever liked is Devonta Smith. But that's because he might be the best route runner to come out of college that I've ever seen. So I was high on Devonta Smith, not as high as other people, but I was high on Devonta Smith, and I'm not as high on these 2 guys as I am with Smith. But I don't really know how they're going to work out. I think if utilized in the correct role, they could be pretty good. Specifically, if a team like Kansas City were to take them in the bottom half of the second round, I think that would be a good situation for them. I've got Jermaine Burton at 7 out of Alabama, top 100 grade on him. I think he's more in that Devontae Adams sort of role as a receiver, though he is someone who does get open deep quite a bit. I think he's an underrated athlete. I think he's underrated in terms of production because I think he's really, really good. And I think he's someone who's just going to come in and be productive in year one. He's going to have like 800 yards and 6 touchdowns. And then that's pretty much just what he's going to be for his whole career. Javon Baker is another one of those Troy Franklin, Tez Walker, Devonta Smith sort of builds. And I get that a lot of people really like him. Like, he's a lot of people's secret gem. I'm not on that board. Again, it might just be just because I don't like that build and I don't like that role, offensively speaking. But I don't like him as much as other people. I think he is someone who's going to have to play on special teams in order to survive in the NFL, and not like as a returner, but like on kickoff and punt. But he is someone who, again, as a complementary piece, I do think has some upside as like a higher end or middle of the pack wide receiver 3. Next guy, Luke McCaffrey and Jamari Thrash to round out the list. Luke McCaffrey is a much better athlete than I thought he was. He is someone who I think probably is going to have to play special teams again. Same thing with Jamari Thrash in order to really stick in the NFL. But he's also someone who would not surprise me if he ended up being just a like competent wide receiver 3 or 4. Same thing with Jamari Trash, though I do think Jamari Trash has a little bit more upside than Luke McCaffrey as an actual wide receiver, but less upside as a special teams player, which is why I have Luke McCaffrey ranked above him. But they're very, very close. Now we get to move on to the final sort of segment here with the offensive line. Now we're going to split this into offensive tackle and interior offensive lineman. But here are the grades that I use. Obviously, it goes top 5 down to UDFA. And this is the strength of the class, in my opinion, is the offensive line. I think probably the number 1 position in this entire class is offensive tackle, and the interior offensive line might be number 2. But we'll talk about the interior guys in a bit here. Let's talk about the offensive tackles. My number 1 tackle in this class is Joe Alt out of Notre Dame. I think he might be one of the best offensive tackle prospects I've ever seen. I have not particularly finalized the actual like numerical grades for these players yet, but he might end up being in like my top 3 or 4 tackles of all time. I don't think he's going to get to number 1 because I had Penei Sewell at number 1, and Joe Alt isn't the athlete that Penei Sewell is. But Joe Alt has a very good chance of being number 2. He's a very technically sound and refined player as an offensive tackle. He's maybe the second best pass blocking offensive lineman in the class, and probably also top 5 in a run blocking sense as well. Now, I really, really like him. I think he's a stud left tackle, but I do not under any circumstances want him to go to the Los Angeles Chargers. Not because like I got a thing against the Chargers or anything, but because I do not want him to move to right tackle, because there's a significant possibility that moving a player like Joe Alt, who is so technically sound from the left side, to the right side might just ruin him entirely. So if he gets drafted to the Chargers, my opinion on what he's going to become at the next level is going to dramatically decrease. But pretty much everybody else, I'm on board with him, as long as they don't want to move him to the right tackle as well. My number 2 tackle is Taliz Fuaga. I think that's how you say his first name, out of Oregon State. He was tremendously good. He's the best run blocker in this class, I think, by a significant margin. He is someone who I think worst case scenario could kick into guard and just be a tremendously good guard as well. But he is athletic enough. He has the length required to be a tackle at the next level. He played on the right side for Oregon State. I think that if the Chargers took him at 5, I wouldn't be too mad. I think he's a very, very good player. Does get beat by pure speed around the edge sometime. However, I think that's more of a technical thing and a get-off problem than it is like an athleticism or pure pass blocking technique problem. He's very, very powerful. He moves people in the run game, and I think he has a tremendous amount of upside, but not the most upside. I still think that's Olu Fashanu out of Penn State at number 3. I think he is the best pass blocking offensive lineman in this class. But he's honestly kind of average as a run blocker. I also think there's a significant possibility that he's the best or second best athlete amongst this offensive line group here. So overall, I'm still pretty high on Olu Fashanu. He did not take the leap like I thought he would to potentially get into that like top 5 pick discussion, but he's still a very, very, very good prospect. My number 4 tackle is Jordan Morgan out of Arizona. And that one's weird. I'm higher on Morgan than I think pretty much everybody. I really, really like Jordan Morgan. He's got clean feet in the pocket. He's a good athlete. He's technically sound in the passing game, and he moves people in the running game. I really like Jordan Morgan, but I do understand why people are lower on him than I am. Although he meets all of the measurables to be an offensive tackle at the next level, he kind of like just barely meets them. And his tape outside of a few instances was just kind of good, like not great, but he had 2 games that really stuck out to me on film, and that was against Stanford and against UCLA, where he went up against 2 draftable edge prospects, and one of which, Laiatu Latu, I think I'm probably going to have maybe even a top 10 grade on, and he won the vast majority of those reps when they played each other. Like, that's some of the best film that any tackle has in this class. However, he also did kind of had bad games against Washington and Utah at the same time. Now, Washington was early on in the season. It was before they had kind of figured out who they were a little bit. But Utah, he done got that excuse. Utah, they just kicked his ass. But I still believe he does have Pro Bowl caliber left tackle upside if we're projecting into the future here a little bit and assuming that he gets some quality coaching and stuff like that. And if we're talking about projections, Amarius Mims, who I also have a top 20 grade on, is the projection of all projections, because the bro has like barely played. Like, he's pretty much just an athlete at this point. Like, we don't really know a whole lot about him, but the athletic profile and the film that we do have on him is very, very good. And he's not making it past the Eagles, man. Like, it's just not happening. He's not making it past the Eagles. We talk about, like, oh, the Eagles need a defensive back or a linebacker. They don't draft those positions high. They do draft offensive linemen high, and Lane Johnson's getting old. So I think there's a significant possibility that he's just a Philadelphia Eagle, and he just doesn't know it yet. So, but I do really like Armanius Mims. I think he has a tremendous amount of upside, like Pro Bowl, All-Pro upside. I think he probably has maybe the 3rd highest ceiling of any offensive tackle prospect in this class because of the length and the athleticism. On the sort of opposite end of that is Troy Fashanu out of Washington. He's very technically sound. He might have to be a guard at the next level. Now, he does meet the athletic and like length requirements to play tackle, but I do think he is going to struggle against some of the freakier sort of athletes along the edge at the next level. And even though I do have a top 20 grade on him because I think he's going to be fantastic, he is someone who I think could potentially struggle at that early on in his career, but I believe that he has the wherewithal mentally and the athletic ability and the technical skill to be able to figure out how to counter those really long pass rushers pretty quickly. But it would also not surprise me at all if he ended up being a Pro Bowl / All-Pro caliber guard as well. Number 7, I have J.C. Latham out of Alabama. And I like J.C. Latham. He's extraordinarily powerful, but he did kind of pretty consistently struggle with speed around the edge. And in the pass game, power worked on him way more often than I thought it probably should have. And the lasting impact that I have of J.C. Latham in my memory is him getting driven backwards and put on his ass by Josiah Stewart on the last play of the Michigan Rose Bowl game. And Josiah Stewart, like, I really like Josiah Stewart, but he's 6'1" and 230 pounds. So he's given up like 130 pounds and like 7 to 10 inches of reach, and he just utterly demolished him on that play. That being said, he's probably the best run blocker in this class. It's probably either him or Fuaga, but I still really, really like him. I think he has Pro Bowl caliber upside as a right tackle. I think he starts day one. And again, he might struggle with speed early on, or hard counter moves is also something I saw him struggle with a little bit. So the more refined pass rushers in the NFL might also be able to give him a little bit of trouble early on in his career. But he is someone who I still think will end up being a worst case scenario starting caliber offensive tackle for a decade in the NFL. I really like J.C. Latham, just not as much as some of this other tackles in what I think is pretty uniformly the greatest tackle class of my lifetime. Number 8, I got Tyler Guyton out of Oklahoma. I really like him too. I think he could be left tackle or right tackle, but he played primarily as a right tackle at Oklahoma, and he did a good job. He was okay as a run blocker, and that's kind of where I think he struggles a little bit. He just doesn't necessarily have the power that a lot of these other tackles do, which is weird because he's 6'7" and 330 pounds. But like, one of my points that I wrote down is that he needs to get stronger in his lower body. Maybe all that weight isn't good weight. Maybe he needs to actually shed weight in order to get some good weight back. I don't know particularly. That would be a process for like the team trainer to go with him through. But I still really, really like him. He's a very, very good pass blocker who's extraordinarily efficient. He just doesn't get beat by a lot of things in pass blocking, so to say. But he does have some significant questions as a run blocker, in my opinion. And because of that, I got him as a top 40 grade and not as high as some of these other players. Number 9, I have Kingsley Suamataia out of BYU. I have a top 50 grade on him. He is, like Troy Fashanu, also someone who I think might become a guard at the next level. I will also say this, Suamataia is my dream pick for the Lions at the end of the second round, or maybe even to trade up a little bit, because he could be your future left guard of the future, or he could be your future left tackle with Taylor Decker probably getting cut after this year. Sneak a little bit of a Lions talk in there for you. But I really like him. He's a very good athlete. He just never took that leap into being a true first-round prospect as a left tackle. However, I would feel comfortable taking him early day 2, like in the top 50 picks like I have his grade. Last guy I have here in the top 10 is Christian Jones out of Texas. He really thoroughly impressed a lot of people at the Senior Bowl. The film, I originally had him graded as like a 4th round sort of guy, but he impressed so many people, and I did watch some of the one-on-ones at the Senior Bowl, that I kind of went back and rewatched some of the stuff, and I was like, okay, no, I see it now. And I really like Christian Jones. I'm just not sure he has the higher end upside of a lot of these other tackles in this class, and because of that, I do have a top 75 grade on him. But I do think he could be a starter day 1 in the NFL and be, at least at a minimum, not a liability. Moving on to our last position group here, the interior offensive line. At number 1, I have Jackson Powers Johnson out of Oregon, and I have a top 20 grade on him. I love him. I think he's going to be a high-end starter as a center or a guard day 1 in the NFL. I would be shocked if he made it past Seattle in the NFL draft. Graham Barton out of Duke is my number 2 guard. He is someone who, in a pinch, I think could move out to tackle if, you get a guy that's hurt or whatever. He also has experience playing center. So Graham Barton is legitimately a guy that I think could probably play and start at every single offensive line position. So he adds a extraordinarily high amount of value simply because of that fact. I mean, I think his freshman year, he played as a center and started, and then he moved out to left tackle the next 2 years and played really well. Like, he's a draftable tackle prospect, but where you really see the upside is as a center or a guard for him. And Zach Frazier, out of West Virginia, is also another guy that I like a lot. I think he's a extraordinarily safe prospect. I think he's going to be a starter as a center or a guard in the NFL for a decade plus. And I think during his peak, he's probably going to play at a Pro Bowl or potentially even all-pro caliber level. At number 4, I have Zach Zinter out of Michigan, who I have a top 50 grade on. And he would probably have a top 40 grade if he had not broken his leg. And broken legs scare me because you may not come back the same from a broken leg. Like, we know how to have a surgery for a ACL or a meniscus or even an Achilles now. People are coming back from that really quick now. But a broken leg is always a devastating injury. And we don't know if he's going to have the same power and if he's going to be able to push off that foot like he had beforehand. So I did bump him down a little bit. But the tape is absolutely outstanding for Zach Zinter. Number 5, I have Connor Beebe out of Kansas State. Powerful, stocky guard who moves people in the run game. Really like him, although I do have some questions about the athleticism. Christian Hayes out of UConn. I have a top 75 grade on him. I do think he is going to be a very good guard at the next level. Cedric Van Pran, center out of Georgia. Again, I think he's somebody who could come in and play right away and be, at least worst case scenario, not a liability, although I do actually question him being a guard. He might have to just be a center at the next level. Christian Mahogany is also another guy that I think I'm higher on than the consensus, but I watch his tape and I just see starting guard all over it. He moves people. He doesn't get beat very often in the pass game, although he does get beat sometimes, like everybody gets beat sometimes. But I think he's a pretty high sort of player in terms of his ceiling, and I very much like him. Bo Limmer out of Arkansas and Tanner Bortolini are both centers that I think could play guard and are phenomenal athletes. Specifically, I want to talk about Tanner Bortolini because he blew up the combine. Like, he had one of the best combines I've ever seen an offensive lineman have. Like, it's him and Taylor Lewan. And the 4th round, to me, is where you kind of put all of the athletes that are basically just athletes. And don't get me wrong, Tanner Bortolini is like a day 3 pick. Like, his film isn't very good. Like, he's okay as a pass blocker, and he's kind of bad as a run blocker. But the athleticism provides a very high ceiling for him. So he is someone who, in the 4th round, because of the athleticism, I would be willing to take a risk on him and hope that I can develop him, because you don't have movement skills like that. You can't teach movement skills like that. You can't teach athleticism like that. I can teach everything else. So he's got all the tools that you want for a center or a guard. And because of that, he's my number 10 interior offensive lineman with a 4th round grade. But what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. And it's at this point I would like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagree with me or you want to tell me your top 10 players on any of the offensive positions, go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. And now with the outro out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.